Once upon a time, in a village rimmed by emerald hills and a river that sang to the moon, there lived a young woman named Clara. The village had the slow, sure rhythm of peasant life. Bread baked at dawn, children trailing after goats, bells calling the faithful to Massachusetts. Yet beneath the ordinary beauty, life could be hard, and hope sometimes felt fragile as a candle in wind. Clara had learned to tend that fragile hope from the woman who raised her, her grandmother, Rosa. Before the sun rose, Rosa would light a candle, lace her fingers along the smooth beads of her rosary, and whisper the prayers someone had taught her and someone before that had taught her, an unbroken string of devotion. "Child," she would say, "no storm is greater than the hand of God that calms the sea. The saints are our witnesses. Pray and keep your light." When Clara was young, the words were a lullaby. Later they became a backbone. She grew with the rosary in her pocket and the smell of incense in her hair. She learned to read the little steady miracles of life, seed to shoot, wound to healed skin, tears to a hand that held hers. Then, one autumn, sickness came upon the household like a thief. Her father, sturdy and kind, grew thin and fevered. The doctors, simple men who knew earth and blood, did what they could. Clara prayed daily at his bedside, fingers white-knuckled on the rosary. But one dawn the breath left him, quietly as a closing door. The village wrapped him in oils and prayers. They chanted psalms and the bell tolled. Clara prayed through the funeral, a rosary for each leaf of the coffin until her voice was raw. Her mother, whose grief fell like a shadow with teeth, stopped coming to Massachusetts. She spoke little, and when she did her words were sharp as winter frost. The comfort that had wrapped the family seemed to unravel. The neighbors offered bread and condolences, but Clara felt as if she were standing on a cliff with wind pushing her toward a dark sea. Mockery came too. Some villagers, jaded by hardship, muttered that praying had not saved her father. "Where is your God now?" they said, and meant it as a knife. Those words pricked, but in Clara something stubborn remained, a dim ember left by her grandmother. She would walk at night to the chapel that crouched by the river, light a single candle, and pray until the smoke blurred the stained glass. On one of those nights, when the rain came down like 1,000 whispering fingers, Clara prayed so long that her knees hurt. Her voice was a thread in the dark. "Lord, if you are real, show me how to hold on. I am breaking." What happened next felt less like an answer and more like a memory waking up. The chapel's wooden walls seemed to melt away. Clara found herself standing on a field of gray that was also a battlefield. Shadows, long, formless, hungry, moved with the sound of 1,000 whispered doubts. They took shapes she felt she had seen before: the townsman's scorn, the neighbor's bitterness, the cold voice of fear. They hissed, "You are alone. You are weak. There is no reason to pray." And then, as if a bell had rung in the sky, a light cut through the gloom. It came not from without but from within the form that had always hung on the chapel wall, the crucifix. In the vision the wood was not flat but alive with light. The wounds of Christ glowed with a gentle fire, and from his heart a warmth poured out like spring. Angels, simple not showy, moved like slow flames around the cross, each one keeping silent watch. "My child," a voice said, neither loud nor small, but exactly what Clara needed. "Faith is not proven when the sun shines but when the storm rages. Stand and I will stand with you." Clara woke on the chapel floor with the taste of rain on her lips but a new heat in her chest. She touched the rosary in her hands and felt the beads as if they were warm. She stood and went home. The vision did not explain everything, but it changed the way she prayed. Her prayers were no longer a pleading. They became a steady cadence, a rhythm that marched even when her feet wanted to turn and run. Word travels in small places. People began to notice the woman who came to the chapel at dawn to light a candle no matter what. She did not preach loudly or condemn. She simply kept her candle lit. Children grew curious. A widow sat beside her. Old men resumed their pews. Her mother, who came and left the first time like a reluctant bird, watched from the doorway. Then the season of storms came. It began with darker clouds than ordinary. The river that had always been friendly, small in summer, full in spring, grew arrogant. It ate the fields, then the road, then doors. Houses trembled. The bell in the chapel rang and the priest, Father Matteo, shouted for men to help with sandbags. Men and women ran. In the center of the chaos, Clara pushed through with a candle and a tin dish, and in her hands a small wooden crucifix she had kept since childhood. God's house, some cried. Foolishness, others barked. The sky split with lightning. For a moment Clara thought the world would break in two. Water hissed around her calves as she ran to the chapel. Inside, the altar was crowded with the spilled hymnals and crooked chairs. A gust of wind blew out the main candles. The place felt suddenly small and raw. Clara stood at the altar, lifted the crucifix with both hands and cried out, not with anger but with a faith that did not need to be loud to pierce the air. Christ calmed the sea. Do not be afraid. It was not magic. The water did not vanish like dust. But people stopped running and turned toward the chapel. Old men, the same men who had scoffed, began to say the rosary in their cracked voices. Hands found hands. A woman who had not prayed in years, Clara's neighbor Bernadette, had her child clutched to her chest and began to pray the Angelus. The whole village, or those who could, joined in. Their prayers rose. It was as if the words themselves put a seam back into the world. When the storm finally passed and sun came, the river receded. The chapel was battered but intact. The crucifix had a smear of mud but its light, real or believed, seemed unbroken. People called Clara the flame of the village, then, and not as mockery. She had not performed an easy miracle of wealth or fame. She had simply held her candle steady in the wind until others noticed that a small flame could become warmth you could gather around. Life after the flood was work. The fields had to be resown, the walls patched, the hearts mended. Clara worked with her hands, helped bread rise, hauled stones. But as she helped, other tests came, tests that cut more like needles. The human heart is complicated. Gratitude can curl into envy, admiration into possessiveness. Some who had watched Clara with suspicion now felt a faint, bitter resentment. She makes us look weak, said one of the men who had once mocked. She puts visions into people's heads, said another voice. Even the shepherd's daughter, who had been Clara's friend, began to whisper that Clara enjoyed the attention. Slander crept in like mold in damp places. Maybe Clara had started those visions to make herself important. Perhaps she was trying to build a following. It stung. More, it alarmed her. Clara found herself waking in the night to the taste of bitterness like metal in her mouth. She found that pride can be a deforming thing even when you never asked for praise. One winter the village held a council. The mayor, a practical man with a ledger always at hand, suggested they appoint Clara as the organizer of a relief fund. She is good with people, he said, and the words were meant practical. But the accusation had already been planted. At the council, a woman named Isabel accused Clara of stirring unrest, bringing false visions to distract from the mayor's plans. Voices rose. Clara could have shouted back. Instead she left the hall and walked to the chapel where the moon washed the pews silver. There she knelt and wept, not from pride but from the ache of being misunderstood. A child's Marian medal clinked against a rosary bead. When she finally went to confession, Father Matteo listened more to her silence than to her words. You asked for a sign and now you are asked to be that sign, he said gently. Do not let the flame be your crown. Let it be your offering. So Clara changed the way she carried her light. She taught women to meet quietly after morning mass in the parlor of the old sacristan. They mended clothes and prayed the rosary together. They shared bread. She taught them to be generous of work, not hungry for praise. She walked the fields with the farmer's wife and helped patch the roof. When the mayor's relief fund finally took shape, Clara offered to be a humble signatory rather than the leader. This small humility, visible and consistent, slowly smoothed some sharp edges. The town's visits to the chapel resumed like tides. A deeper test came in the form of silence. One spring as the village celebrated the return of green, Clara woke hoarse. Her throat ached. Days passed and then weeks. Her voice dwindled to a rasp. She could still pray but speaking aloud drained her. It was a strange humiliation. The woman who had rallied villagers in storms could not lift her voice to lead a prayer. Some days she could not even sing at Mass. She could have withdrawn. Instead she learned to speak with her hands and her work. Her eyes, already steady, learned to say kindness. She visited the sick more often, cooking porridge with a patience that did not need applause. She listened to the children with the attention of a gardener who knows when to water. Her silence revealed an important truth. Faith does not depend on the orator but on the offering. A whispered prayer given with love may be more potent than the loud cry of self. But Clara also sought help. She went to the doctor who gave herbs and warming broths. She went to the priest and received the sacrament of the sick, not because she assumed immediate healing, but because being anointed reminded her of God's nearness in weakness. In the quiet of her recovery she read the saints. Teresa of Avila on interior life, Teresa on doing small things with great love. She learned to see the flame's purpose, not to dazzle but to illumine what is around it. Renewal came slowly like the thaw. Her voice returned not as a trumpet but as a bell, clearer for the years of silence. She returned to leading the women's morning prayers, not with the heat of zeal that had once burned too bright, but with warmth and steadiness. The village began sending more travelers to church, not only in storms but in gratitude. People started small acts of charity without being told. A basket left on a doorstep, someone sweeping the steps of the chapel. Years passed. Clara aged in the same way a tree whose roots go deep ages. Lines around her eyes where laughter and tears had lived, hands calloused by work and prayer. Her grandmother died and the rosary Rosa had kept was passed down to Clara's hand. Clara married Christ in a different way than the married might. She married a life of service. She never married for this world, though she loved with a deep affection the people she served. Her love was not a romance but a devotion woven into bread and water. The years were not a simple story of triumph. Misunderstandings returned from time to time. Fire struck a barn one winter, and once again the town asked who would take the first shovel. Clara was there, sleeves rolled, shoulder to the wheel. When the mayor fell ill and could not sign the papers for a new well, Clara stepped in only to organize the well workers and negotiate fair shares for water. She made mistakes and apologized. The village learned a new currency, humility. One autumn, a stranger came, a pilgrim with dusty feet and a staff. He told stories of a distant shrine where a statue of the Mother of God wept not with sorrow but with the quiet consolation of a mother. Many in the village, tired and tempted to cynicism, wanted only to stay. But a few, Clara among them, felt a pull. They saved their coins, took a week, and went in a small procession led by their priest. The pilgrimage was simple. They walked under stars and ate in barns. The air smelled of hay and prayer. At the shrine the pilgrims knelt. Clara placed her rosary on the altar and whispered, not one long speech but a little list of names. Her grandmother, her father, the children of the village, the widow who mended shirts, even the man who had once whispered that she loved the attention. She asked for nothing flashy. She asked for perseverance. There before the statue something like peace fell over her. The pilgrims sang and the sound was not perfect but whole. Clara understood the shrine. It was not proof of supernatural extravagance but a place where the heart and the church's memory met. She felt the communion of saints close, not like a crowd watching but like a family leaning in. She came home steadier. The final test came without fanfare. Her mother, who had once shut her heart against the church in grief, grew ill with an age-old slowness that took memory first. One morning Clara found her mother staring at the wall, fingers tapping an old rhythm that had nothing to do with prayer. Doctors said it was something called forgetfulness, and the village called it a sorrow none of them knew how to name. This time Clara did not go into visions or public gestures. She sat by her mother's bed for long hours, combing hair, recounting small stories of the past that coaxed a smile. The time a calf escaped into the chapel yard, the smell of rosemary on a Sunday bread. She prayed the rosary aloud, slowly, as if laying each bead against a wound. Frequently, her mother's eyes would clear, and for a breath she would be Rosa's daughter again, the woman who once said, "No storm is greater." And Clara would press her forehead to her mother's hand and feel the old rhythm come back. On a morning gray and ordinary no one would single out, Clara's mother opened her eyes and said, with the old cadence, "Light the candle, Clara." It was not miraculous in the way people in books expect. It was a seam of ordinary mercy stitched across the fabric of their lives. The neighborhood noticed. People who had once argued with Clara now brought soup. The man who had mocked now met her in the churchyard with an awkward nod. Decades later, the village would tell the story of the girl who kept her candle in the chapel and, more importantly, kept her hands busy. Some of the children she had taught as girls became nurses, priests, teachers. The women's circle grew. They established a small clinic and a school, nothing grand but steady, like the kind of construction that is meant to last. Visitors came sometimes to see the chapel that had somehow stood through the flood and the fires. They saw not a shrine of miracles but a place where ordinary people learned to pray. Clara grew older and quieter. She taught younger women that faith is 1,000 small choices. To forgive a neighbor, to forgive yourself, to go to confession when your pride gets in the way, to receive the Eucharist in humility, to befriend the lonely. She told them that visions, if they came, were not to be flaunted. They were like seeds. Plant them, nurture them, let them grow fruit so others might eat. She told them that the rosary was a compass, not merely beads. One evening, near the end of her life, Clara walked to the chapel as she had so often done. The river hummed gently and the bell gave a small, steady tone. She placed her hand on the cool wood of the pew and thought of Rosa, of Father Matteo, of the mayor who had once feared change, of the child who had once called her flame with real warmth. Her voice was thin now, but she closed her eyes and prayed the simple prayer that had steadied her for decades. Lord, let me be a light for others. Do not let my light be a flame that burns out, but one that warms. A young woman, a teacher from the village, was kneeling when Clara entered. She looked up and smiled, the sort of smile that says more than words. We come every morning, the woman said, and Clara knew the work would continue. Clara died in the quiet of the morning, not in a spectacle but in the small room by the hearth, her rosary threaded through her fingers. The whole village came to the chapel for her funeral. They sang imperfect songs and it didn't matter. The mayor spoke and the children recited a prayer. The river, which had once threatened to drown them, flowed by as if it too had learned to be steady. They buried Clara beneath a tree that was her favorite place to sit and pray. A small cross marked the grave. Years later, when storms came and frightened children woke, mothers would tell the story of Clara, how she had lifted a crucifix in a chapel and how she had been a woman of prayer and work. They would tell how she had been mocked and misunderstood, how she had been silenced and had found new ways to speak, and how she had taught others to be steady flames. And if you are a woman who knows the cautious, stubborn beating of prayer in your own chest, if you live where the storms blow and the neighbors fear and sometimes faith seems like an old candle, then remember Clara of the village. Not because she was perfect but because she kept showing up. Not because she performed the loudest miracle, but because she taught a village that faith is a way of living. Small acts, repeated daily, offered to God. Clara's last lesson, whispered often at the women's circle and in the silence of the chapel, was this: do not make the flame your glory. Let it warm your hands so you may reach for others. Trust the sacraments, hold the rosary, go to confession when your heart grows heavy, receive the Eucharist in humility, and then, love. That is how a village is saved. So keep your small light. Tend it like a plant. And when the wind comes, remember, it is often the quiet, steady flames that teach the world how to be brave.